What do you do when the past you've been running from catches up with you? Rufus thought he had found refuge in the wilds of Montana, away from the ghosts of war and loss. But when a seemingly innocent rescue mission turns into a life-or-death struggle, he's forced to confront more than just the storm outside. He's up against a force that will stop at nothing to silence the truth. The biggest betrayal comes from those you least expect, and the quiet cabin in the mountains becomes the backdrop for a deadly game. Hit like, subscribe, and comment below with your theories. Where are you watching from as the mystery unfolds? Rufus Mitchell, a black veteran of the U.S. Army, was used to silence, but it had never been quite like this. He had come to Montana far from the noise of city life, far from the chaos that had haunted him for years. The war was over, but it had left scars deeper than the ones he could see. He needed a place to find peace, or perhaps to lose himself. The small, isolated cabin in the heart of the Montana wilderness seemed like the perfect retreat, a place where he could finally confront the ghosts that followed him. Nestled between tall, snow-covered pines, the cabin belonged to his late grandfather, a man who had understood the meaning of solitude. Rufus had inherited it upon his grandfather's passing, and though he had little attachment to the land, it seemed like the only refuge that could offer him the stillness he sought. The cabin was simple, rustic, and weathered by time, much like his own soul. As he stepped onto the porch, the door creaked loudly in protest, its old hinges groaning as he pushed it open. The smell of dust and old wood greeted him, and the silence inside was almost oppressive. He set down his duffel bag by the door, looking around at the worn furnishings that had once been the backdrop to his grandfather's life. The place had been abandoned for years, and its silence only reminded him of the void he'd come to fill. He tossed his jacket over the back of a chair, the fire in the stove crackling softly. His muscles were tense, not just from the long drive, but from years of carrying the weight of his memories. He sank into the armchair by the fire, rubbing his tired eyes. The war, the trauma, the people he had lost, it was all still there, lurking beneath his skin. It didn't matter how far he traveled. The memories followed, stubborn and uninvited. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, a welcome distraction. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe. The world outside the cabin was blanketed in snow, quiet and cold, just like his heart felt most days. He was far from the cities, far from everything he knew. But still something gnawed at him, a feeling that he wasn't truly alone. His gaze shifted to the window, where the thick snow was falling faster, swirling in the wind. The storm was growing stronger, and for the first time in hours, he was struck by the sensation that someone or something was outside. He shook his head, blaming the isolation, the weight of his own thoughts. He didn't believe in signs or omens, and certainly not in anything that could disturb the cold silence of the mountains. But then came the sound. A faint, almost imperceptible whimper from outside, followed by the soft padding of paws in the snow. Rufus froze, his breath catching in his throat. He listened, and there it was again, a low, desperate whine. It was coming from just outside the door. He stood, his heart thumping in his chest. What was it? A wolf, a coyote, a wild animal in need? Or perhaps just the wind playing tricks? Rufus moved to the door, slowly listening intently. The storm outside seemed to intensify, but the sound was unmistakable. He opened the door just enough to peer out, and there, lying in the snow, was a dog. A German shepherd, its body covered in snow, its fur matted with what looked like blood. It was still alive, barely. The dog's amber eyes locked with Rufus's as it let out another whimper, its body trembling. Without thinking, Rufus rushed outside, carefully lifting the dog into his arms. The animal was heavier than he expected, but its weight felt familiar, like something he had once known, something he had once protected. The dog let out a soft growl, not of aggression, but of exhaustion. It was clear that it had been through hell to make it here to this moment. Rufus carried the dog inside, shutting the door against the howling wind. He gently placed the animal near the stove, where the warmth could help revive it. His military training kicked in automatically. He quickly checked the dog for injuries, finding deep gashes along its side and smaller jagged wounds on its paws. It was clear that this animal had been in a fight for its life. It wasn't just the storm, it had been hurt by something far worse. Rufus opened his duffel bag, pulling out his first aid kit. He worked quickly, but methodically, cleaning the dog's wounds and stitching up the worst of them. The dog didn't resist, but its body trembled violently as the pain from the injuries washed over it. Rufus stayed focused, his hands steady as he worked. He didn't look at the dog's face, didn't want to. He didn't need to see the pain in those eyes. The connection between them was already established in silence. As Rufus worked, the dog's amber eyes followed every movement, watching him with a quiet intensity. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin the fire crackled and the room filled with warmth. Stretched stiffly, his muscles sore from the drive and the work of caring for the dog the night before. The fire had died down to embers, but the warmth it had provided the night before lingered in the room. Scout the German Shepherd was still curled up near the stove, his breathing steady and deep. Rufus stood and moved quietly to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to peer outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of pristine white. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the snow-covered ground. It was beautiful, but it felt eerily still. He glanced over at Scout, still asleep, his coat now free of snow and blood, but marred by the stitches that Rufus had carefully placed the night before. The dog's amber eyes flickered open, locking onto Rufus immediately. It lifted its head slowly, its gaze following Rufus as he moved around the cabin. Rufus couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection with the dog, a bond that was stronger than mere happenstance. It wasn't just the fact that he had saved it, it was the way the dog seemed to understand him, as if it recognized something deep inside him. Scout's eyes were filled with quiet understanding, a look that spoke volumes without a single word. Rufus moved to the small kitchen area and began preparing some coffee. He worked silently, his mind still reeling from the events of the night before. He hadn't expected to find a wounded animal outside his door. He hadn't expected to find anything at all, really. His original plan was to spend a few weeks in solitude, doing nothing but clearing his mind and escaping the memories that followed him like shadows. But now, with the dog recovering at his feet, his purpose had shifted. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about this dog, this creature that had found him, dragged itself to his doorstep, and asked for help. Rufus set the pot of coffee down and turned to look at the dog again. Scout was watching him with those intense amber eyes, his head tilted slightly, as if waiting for something. Rufus took a deep breath and walked over to the dog kneeling beside it. "You're not a stray, are you?" he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. Scout didn't answer, of course, but there was something in the way the dog watched him that made Rufus feel like he had already spoken the truth. He ran his hand over Scout's fur, feeling the warmth of the animal beneath his fingers. It wasn't just the body heat. There was something else there, something deeper, a connection that had no explanation. The dog seemed to lean into the touch, nuzzling his hand, as if he was grateful for the care. Rufus stood and paced the room, trying to clear his head. He needed to think, needed to focus. But his thoughts kept returning to Scout. Why had the dog come to him? It had been in dire straits, yet it had made its way through the storm to find him. Rufus had heard of animals finding their way home before, but this felt different. There was intent behind it. He could feel it in the way Scout had looked at him, in the way the dog had waited for him to act. As he walked around the cabin, Rufus's mind wandered to the war. The things he had seen, the things he had done, the things he had lost. His time in the service had scarred him in ways that couldn't be seen on his body. His muscles were strong, his limbs still capable of great endurance, but his mind was a battlefield of its own, and the ghosts of the men he had fought alongside still haunted him. He had come here to escape that, to leave it all behind. But the war had followed him, and so had the wounds. Rufus stopped near the door, staring out at the endless expanse of snow. The isolation was supposed to bring him peace, but it only made the memories more vivid. The wind howled outside, but he didn't hear it. The memories of his comrades, the weight of the rifle in his hands, the terror of not knowing if he'd survive it all came rushing back. Scout, sensing his distress, stood up and moved toward him. The dog was still weak, still recovering, but it walked with a purpose, its movements steady and slow. Rufus watched as Scout approached him, its head low, but its eyes unwavering. Without thinking, Rufus knelt down again, looking into the dog's amber gaze. "What do you want from me, huh?" he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. The dog didn't answer, of course, but there was something in that stare that made Rufus feel like he wasn't alone. For the first time in a long time, he felt like someone or something understood him. Scout nudged his hand gently, and Rufus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was something else, something deeper that had drawn them together. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that this dog, this injured animal that had stumbled into his life, had a purpose. And maybe, just maybe, it was to help him find his own. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the warmth of the cabin seemed to fill the emptiness that had lingered in Rufus's chest. The dog wasn't just an animal. It was a companion, a silent witness to the pain he carried with him. Rufus had always been used to carrying his burdens alone, but now, in the presence of Scout, he didn't feel quite as heavy. Rufus woke to the sound of the wind picking up again, a howling reminder that the winter storm was far from over. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin's worn wooden floor. Scout was awake too, sitting by the stove and watching Rufus with those familiar amber eyes, as if waiting for something. Rufus stood up stretched and moved toward the small kitchen area, preparing a simple breakfast. The cabin felt colder than it had the night before, as if the storm outside had somehow seeped into the bones of the place. His mind was still heavy from the events of the past day. The dog Scout had come to him, found him in his solitude, and in the process stirred something inside of him that he hadn't realized he had buried so deep. But as he went about his morning routine, Rufus couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Scout's arrival, something he wasn't seeing yet. The dog's behavior had been odd from the beginning, staring out the window with an intensity that almost seemed human. Rufus couldn't explain it, but he felt like Scout was trying to tell him something, as if the dog had some kind of purpose, a mission that was tied to him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Rufus finished preparing his meal, setting the plate down on the table. Scout watched him closely, his head tilting slightly, as if trying to comprehend the routine. Rufus sat down and picked up his fork, but the unease gnawed at him again. The silence of the cabin felt oppressive today, and he had a strange sensation in his chest. He had come here to escape, to be alone with his thoughts. But now, with Scout by his side, the peace felt incomplete. It was as if the dog was waiting for something too. Rufus pushed the plate aside and stood up. He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the door, needing to clear his head. Scout followed him to the door, standing still watching him with that unwavering gaze. Rufus looked down at the dog, then back out at the snow-covered landscape. There was no clear reason for why he felt this way. There were no visible threats, no immediate danger. But something told him the quiet of the morning was a mask for something deeper. As Rufus opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, the wind hit him hard, making him stagger slightly. The air was colder than he expected, biting at his skin as it carried the scent of the wilderness around him. The trees swayed, creaking under the pressure of the wind, and snow was still falling in thick flurries, covering the ground in an even blanket of white. It was beautiful, but it also felt isolating, like the world was closing in around him. He stepped off the porch and began walking toward the forest, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The snow was deep, the landscape untouched, and the silence was almost deafening. His thoughts seemed to echo in the stillness too loud in his mind. Scout had followed him out, trotting behind him with an ease that belied the severity of the storm. The dog was recovering well from his injuries, and Rufus couldn't help but notice how strong and determined Scout had become in such a short time. It was almost as if the dog had a sense of purpose, as if he had a goal that he was striving toward. Rufus turned to look back at the cabin. It was a small figure in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, and he suddenly had the thought that maybe he wasn't the one seeking peace here. Maybe it was the dog. Rufus's gaze shifted back to the woods ahead of him. It was then that he saw a faint movement in the distance. Something or someone was out there hidden in the snow. He stopped in his tracks, his instincts kicking in as he scanned the area. There was no mistaking the way the figure moved. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too controlled. It was a person. Rufus's heart started to race. He hadn't seen anyone since he arrived at the cabin. The thought of someone being out here in the middle of this storm sent a chill down his spine. He crouched down, motioning for Scout to stay close. The dog obeyed without hesitation, its body tense as it crouched low to the ground, watching the figure with a focused intensity. Rufus slowly moved forward, his steps careful as he tried to close the distance without alerting whoever it was to his presence. The figure was moving slowly, methodically, as if it was lost, or worse, hunting. Rufus's mind raced as he considered his options. He could call out approach cautiously, or he could turn back to the cabin and lock himself inside. He wasn't sure which would be the smarter choice, but the presence of the dog beside him gave him a strange sense of reassurance. Scout was on alert, his body still and poised to act, and Rufus knew that the dog would follow his lead. As they moved closer, Rufus could see that the figure was stumbling, as if exhausted or injured. It was hard to make out details in the heavy snowfall, but the person's movements were erratic, unsteady. Rufus's first instinct was to help to offer assistance. But something about the situation didn't feel right. His hand instinctively went to the pistol at his side. He wasn't expecting trouble, but he'd learned long ago to be prepared for anything. The figure finally came into clearer view as the snow parted, revealing an older man hunched over and shivering. His clothes were tattered, and his face was gaunt as if he had been out in the storm for days. He looked up at Rufus, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Help, please," the man gasped, barely able to speak over the howling wind. "They're coming." Rufus didn't move, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's words hit him like a cold slap, and his grip on the gun tightened. Before he could react, the man collapsed into the snow, his body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Scout immediately moved forward, nudging the man's limp body with his nose as if trying to wake him. Rufus knelt beside the stranger, checking for a pulse. It was weak, barely there, but it was enough to confirm that the man was still alive. He was breathing shallowly, his body close to freezing. "Hold on, an old man," Rufus muttered under his breath. "I've got you." The storm was picking up again, the wind howling louder as it swept through the trees. Rufus stood pulling the man into his arms and heading back toward the cabin. Scout trotted ahead, leading the way as the snow seemed to swallow them up. The storm was relentless, but Rufus didn't stop. He couldn't. The man needed help, and whether he liked it or not, Rufus was the one who had to provide it. As they reached the cabin, Rufus kicked open the door with his boot, stumbling inside with the unconscious man in tow. He laid him on the floor next to the fire, his hands shaking as he tried to remove the man's wet clothes and tend to his frostbitten hands and feet. The dog lay quietly by the fire, watching, waiting as if it knew exactly what needed to be done. Rufus sat by the fire, watching the old man whose shallow breaths rattled in his chest. The room was thick with the smell of damp wool and wet clothes, but there was something else too. A heaviness that clung to the air, a sense of foreboding that Rufus couldn't shake. He had done everything he could to warm the man, but the storm outside wasn't the only thing that had frozen him. His body was cold, yes, but something in his eyes, something about the way he had collapsed into the snow, told Rufus that this man was running from something more than just the elements. As the fire crackled, Rufus checked the man's pulse again, ensuring he was still alive, though barely. His body was frail, his hands and feet stiff with frostbite. Rufus had seen it before, had witnessed the way nature could break a person down when they were pushed to their limit. But there was more to this man's story than simply a struggle against the storm. It was the look in his eyes, the frantic desperation in his voice when he spoke. "They're coming," he had said. Who were they? What had he meant? Rufus stood up, pacing the cabin as the wind howled outside. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He hadn't expected to find a man lost in the wilderness, certainly not one in this condition. But he had no choice now but to help him, even though every instinct told him to keep his distance. The dog scout lay still by the fire, his body tense and alert. Rufus glanced at him, and for a moment, he almost felt like Scout was waiting for him to do something, as though the dog knew more than he did. It was unnerving the way the dog's presence seemed to fill the room. There was a purpose to it, an unspoken connection that Rufus couldn't explain. Rufus took a deep breath, trying to push aside the unease, and turned his attention back to the man. He was starting to stir his body, shivering violently, as the warmth from the fire slowly worked its way into his frozen limbs. Rufus bent down gently, shaking his shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low. The man's eyes flickered open, the pale blue gaze fixated on Rufus as he groaned in pain. Water. He rasped his throat dry. Rufus grabbed his canteen, tilting it to the man's lips, watching as he drank greedily, though it was clear that the man wasn't fully aware of what was happening. "Who are you?" Rufus asked, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Why are you out there in that storm?" The man's eyes widened slightly, fear creeping into his expression. He looked around the cabin as though making sure no one else was watching, and then he whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen. They're after me." Rufus felt a chill run down his spine. "Who's after you?" He pressed his heart pounding. The man's lips trembled, and he tried to sit up, but his body was too weak. "They know what I've seen." "What I know," the man said in a hoarse voice, his eyes darting nervously toward the window, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. "I'm not safe here. They'll come for me. They'll find me." Rufus didn't understand, couldn't make sense of what the man was saying, but there was something in his eyes that told Rufus he wasn't lying. Whatever it was, whatever this man had seen or knew, it had terrified him enough to drive him into the storm to risk everything. "Who are they?" Rufus asked again, his voice more insistent. The man swallowed hard, wincing in pain as he shifted his weight. I can't say," he whispered, "but they'll come for you too. They're watching. Always watching." His voice trailed off as his eyes fluttered shut again. Rufus stood there stunned, unsure of what to make of the man's cryptic words. He had been expecting a simple rescue, a lost soul wandering through a storm, nothing more. But now, things were different. The storm outside wasn't the only danger, and whatever this man had seen, whatever had driven him to this cabin, it was far from over. Rufus sat back down by the fire, his mind racing. The man had said they were always watching. He glanced at Scout, who was still lying on the floor, but now with a sense of alertness, his eyes fixed on the door. Rufus couldn't shake the feeling that this dog knew something that was still hidden from him. The storm raged on outside, but inside it felt as though the temperature had dropped. A chill ran through the cabin, not from the cold, but from the weight of the mystery that was unfolding. The man had been running from something, and whatever it was coming closer, and now Rufus was caught in the middle of it. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. He had been trying to escape the chaos of his past, but now it seemed that chaos had found him. The wind howled again, louder than before, shaking the cabin's walls. Scout stood up, moving toward the door. Rufus followed his gaze, but there was nothing out there but snow and darkness. Yet the dog's body was rigid, every muscle tense as though something or someone was approaching. Rufus stood and walked to the window, his heart racing in his chest. He couldn't see anything beyond the swirling snow, but he felt the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. The man's words echoed in his mind. They're coming. The air outside felt heavier now, thick with an impending sense of danger. Rufus turned back to the fire, where the man lay still unconscious, his breathing shallow. He didn't know what to do next. He had come to Montana to find peace, to escape the war, but now there was no escaping this. Whatever had driven this man into the storm had also brought danger to his door, and he wasn't sure how much longer they would be safe. Rufus reached for his rifle, which was leaning against the wall by the door, and checked it carefully. He knew he wasn't prepared for whatever was coming, but he also knew that he couldn't let fear paralyze him. Not now. Scout stood by the door, growling softly. Rufus stepped towards the dog, his hand tightening around the rifle. "What do you know?" he muttered under his breath. The dog's amber eyes met his, and for the first time, Rufus felt a sense of certainty. Whatever danger was coming, they would face it together. It was the only choice they had. As the storm continued to rage outside, Rufus waited in the dim light of the cabin, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He wasn't sure who was coming, or what they wanted, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't run. Not this time. Rufus stood by the fire rifle in hand, his gaze flicking between the door and the man lying unconscious on the floor. The storm outside had become a constant roar, drowning out every other sound, but the feeling in the air had changed. There was something waiting, something unseen, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced at Scout, who was standing at the door, his body coiled tight, ready for something. The dog had been acting strange all morning, and Rufus couldn't shake the feeling that Scout knew more about what was happening than he did. The old man's warning kept echoing in his mind. They're coming. Who were they? What had he seen? What was he running from? Rufus didn't know, but he wasn't about to wait around to find out. He paced the room, the cabin feeling smaller with every passing minute. It was as if the walls were closing in on him, and the air was thick with the promise of something bad. He glanced out the window, but the snowstorm had blurred the world beyond. The landscape was swallowed up in white, and there was no sign of anything or anyone coming. But he still felt the nagging sense that something was approaching. He reached for his jacket and pulled it on the leather, feeling heavy against his shoulders. He wasn't sure what he was preparing for, but his instincts were screaming at him to be ready. He turned back to the old man. The man was still lying on the floor, his face pale, but his breathing was steady now. Rufus wasn't sure if he was going to survive the night, but he had to try. He moved back over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Wake up." The old man's eyes fluttered open, and he groaned softly. His eyes were unfocused, but when they met Rufus's gaze, they widened in panic. "They're here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You don't understand. They'll come for you. They'll..." He stopped, his breath hitching as he tried to sit up. Rufus crouched down beside him. "Who? Who's coming for us?" The man's lips trembled and his eyes darted toward the door. He opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could say anything, the door slammed open. The wind rushed in with a howl, the snow swirling into the cabin like a living thing. Rufus was on his feet, instantly rifle raised, scanning the darkening doorway, but there was nothing there, no one waiting outside in the storm. The old man's body went rigid, his eyes wide with terror. "They've found us," he gasped. "We're dead." Rufus didn't know what to believe anymore. Was this all just some fevered delusion, or was the man really telling the truth? The storm outside made it impossible to see anything clearly, but the man's fear was palpable. It was enough to make Rufus hesitate. "Who are they?" Rufus demanded, his voice sharp. "Who's coming for you?" The man opened his mouth, but before he could speak, a low growl rumbled from Scout. Rufus turned to look at the dog, whose body was tense, every muscle on alert. Scout's gaze was fixed on the door, his ears perked up, and his tail was straight behind him. Rufus felt a chill creep down his spine. The dog wasn't reacting like this for nothing. He'd learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, everything in him was telling him that the danger was real. "What's out there?" Rufus muttered under his breath. The old man's eyes darted between the door and Rufus. "It's too late," he whispered. "You won't survive this. None of us will." Rufus's heart raced. He had no idea who was out there or what they were up against, but he couldn't let fear paralyze him. He had to make a decision. His mind raced, thinking of every scenario, every possibility. He turned back to the window, but there was still nothing to see. The storm was so thick that the world outside had become an impenetrable wall of white. "I'm not waiting around to die," Rufus muttered to himself. He moved towards the door, rifle in hand, his heart pounding. Scout stayed close by his side, his eyes never leaving the doorway. Rufus opened the door, cautiously peering into the storm. For a moment, there was nothing but the howling wind and the blinding snow. But then, just beyond the edge of the porch, Rufus saw something move. A shadow. It was too quick to make out, but it was there. His pulse quickened. He stepped outside, the cold biting into his skin, but the sense of urgency burning through him was stronger than any chill. Scout moved beside him, his body low and ready. The shadow moved again, just at the edge of his vision. Rufus's hand tightened around the rifle, ready to face whatever was coming. And then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Footsteps crunching in the snow. Someone was out there, and they were getting closer. Rufus motioned for Scout to stay quiet as he crouched down, moving toward the trees. His eyes darted between the shifting snow and the distant silhouette. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were close. Too close. The footsteps grew louder, and Rufus held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't sure who he was about to face, but he was sure of one thing: he wasn't backing down. The figure finally emerged from the snowstorm, its outline barely visible against the white backdrop. But Rufus could see enough to know it wasn't alone. There were more of them moving in the distance, shadowy figures that blended in with the storm. The first figure took a step forward, and Rufus's finger tightened on the trigger. But before he could fire, Scout lunged forward, barking furiously. The sound shattered the silence, and Rufus's instincts kicked in. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing through the mountains. The figures froze. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, Rufus thought he had scared them off. But then the wind shifted, and he saw the truth. The figures were closing in, moving faster now, their shapes becoming clearer in the storm. The man had been right. They were here, and they weren't going away. Rufus's heart pounded in his chest as the snow around him seemed to hold its breath. The figures in the distance weren't backing down. They were closing in slowly, methodically, like predators circling their prey. Scout was in front of him, low to the ground. His hackles raised, his eyes locked on the approaching figures with a ferocity that matched Rufus's own rising tension. The wind howled around them, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the soft crunch of snow beneath the boots of those who dared approach. Rufus tightened his grip on his rifle, his finger brushing the trigger, but not pulling it just yet. He wasn't sure if he should fire first. He didn't know who these people were, what they wanted, but the desperation in the old man's eyes, the words he had whispered, made one thing painfully clear. He wasn't just being watched by the storm. He was being hunted. The first figure stepped into view, its face obscured by the swirling snow, but the shape was unmistakable, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the silent precision of someone used to moving in the wilderness. Rufus's instincts screamed at him to retreat, to find cover, but he couldn't. He wouldn't abandon the cabin, not with the old man inside, not with Scout at his side, not when danger was already at the doorstep. Another figure appeared beside the first, and then another, and soon they were all within view, just barely visible through the snow, but moving steadily forward. They weren't in a hurry, and that only made Rufus more uneasy. Whoever these people were, they were patient. They knew exactly what they were doing. Scout growled low in his throat, and Rufus whispered to him, "Stay." The dog obeyed, but his body was rigid, his eyes flicking between the figures and his master. Rufus took another step forward, keeping his rifle ready, but lowering it slightly, unsure of whether he would need to shoot. The figures were closer now, too close for comfort, and as they neared, he could see them more clearly. They were all dressed in heavy dark coats, their faces obscured by scarves or hoods, their eyes cold and calculating. They moved with the grace of people who had seen violence, who had dealt it and received it, and it made Rufus's skin crawl. The first figure, the one who had led the group, stopped just a few yards away from Rufus. He was taller than Rufus by a few inches, with a hard, angular face that showed no emotion. "You must be the one they warned us about," the man said, his voice low but confident. Rufus didn't respond immediately. He couldn't be sure if the man was speaking to him or to someone else, but the words sent a chill down his spine. "What do you want?" Rufus asked, his voice steady, despite the fear creeping up on him. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned toward the cabin where the old man still lay, his body motionless in the dim light. Rufus tensed. "We've been looking for him for a long time," the man continued, his eyes narrowing. "And we can't have you getting in the way." Rufus felt the weight of the man's words settle on his chest like a heavy stone. The old man wasn't just some random wanderer lost in the storm. He was something much more dangerous, something these people had been hunting. But what exactly did they want from him? And why had the old man come here? He felt Scout's body shift beside him, and for a moment he considered retreating back into the cabin, maybe even trying to get the old man to safety. But that wouldn't solve anything. These people were here for a reason, and Rufus wasn't going to let them walk away without answers. "You're after him?" Rufus asked, his voice low. The man's lips curled into a small, grim smile. "We're after the truth. He's the key to everything." Rufus's grip tightened on his rifle, and his heart raced. What truth, he demanded. The man's smile faltered, but he didn't answer. Instead, he looked at his companions and nodded. They were moving in now, surrounding Rufus and the cabin in a way that made it clear they had all the time in the world. That made them dangerous. That made them far more terrifying than any storm. Rufus's finger hovered over the trigger, but he didn't fire. Not yet. He was waiting for something, waiting for a sign that would tell him what to do next. The tension in the air was thick, heavy with unspoken threats, and he could feel it coiling tighter and tighter around him. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man said, his voice suddenly softer, more threatening. "You're out of your depth." Rufus's pulse quickened, and Scout growled again, this time louder. The dog was ready. Rufus could feel it. He could feel the loyalty coursing through the dog, a bond that was unbreakable no matter what came next. "I'm not leaving, Rufus," said his voice steady, despite the danger surrounding him. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me." The man's expression darkened, and he stepped forward, his posture menacing. "Then you'll die like the rest." Rufus didn't hesitate. He swung his rifle up, aiming it squarely at the man's chest. The cold wind whipped around them, but it didn't matter. His focus was absolute. In that moment, he was no longer just a man trying to escape his past. He was a protector fighting for survival, fighting for the people and the dog that mattered. The group of figures shifted, but none of them made a move toward him. They knew better. Rufus didn't flinch, didn't lower the rifle. The man in front of him stared at the barrel, his eyes narrowing, but Rufus could see the flicker of doubt in his gaze. He wasn't expecting resistance. He wasn't expecting a fight. But Rufus had been in too many fights before to let this one pass him by. He wasn't going to die today. Not here. Not in the snow. The man's hand slowly moved toward his own side, and Rufus's muscles tensed. Was he reaching for a weapon? Rufus didn't wait to find out. He fired a warning shot into the snow at the man's feet, and the loud crack of the rifle broke the stillness of the storm. The man froze, and the others behind him shifted uneasily. Rufus took a step forward, rifle still aimed at the man. "I said I'm not leaving," he repeated, his voice low and steady. The man's eyes flicked to his companions and then back at Rufus. For a long moment, no one moved. It felt like the entire world had stopped, frozen in place by the threat in the air. Finally, the man took a step back, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of surrender. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice cold. Rufus didn't lower the rifle. He kept his focus on the man. "I'm not the one making mistakes," he said, his voice sharp. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned away, his companions following suit. They didn't retreat immediately, but their retreat was clear. They would be back. Rufus knew that much for sure. As they disappeared into the storm, Rufus exhaled, slowly lowering the rifle. He didn't trust them, not for a second, but for now, he had won. For now, the cabin was safe. The old man, Scout, and Rufus. They were safe for the moment. Rufus watched as the last of the figures melted into the snowstorm, their silhouettes slowly swallowed by the relentless flurry of white. His rifle was still raised, his grip tight on the cold metal, but his heart was pounding in his chest, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He had expected a confrontation, but not like this. These weren't just random trespassers. They were organized, methodical, and they had a clear mission. They wanted something, and whatever that something was, it involved the old man lying unconscious on the floor, and by extension, Rufus himself. He didn't know what to make of it yet, but he couldn't deny the reality of the situation. They weren't going to stop. Not until they got what they came for. Scout was still by his side, watching the door, his ears alert, his body tense, as if waiting for something more. The dog's behavior wasn't like that of a normal animal. Scout had been more than just a companion during the last few days. He had been a protector, a silent guardian. Rufus couldn't shake the feeling that the dog knew more than he did about what was happening. He turned back to the cabin, looking at the man on the floor. The storm raged outside, but inside, the air was thick with uncertainty. Rufus had made it clear to the group that they weren't going to get through him easily, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try again. They had made it far too easy for Rufus to see that they were not ordinary people. They were professionals, hunters perhaps, or worse, they were part of something much larger, something that Rufus wasn't even close to understanding. He moved towards the man crouching beside him and gently checking his vitals again. The old man's breathing was still shallow but steady. He had survived the storm and the cold, but that didn't mean he was out of the woods yet. Rufus knew he couldn't keep him in this state for long. He needed to know what had brought this man here, what had made him a target. He wasn't going to find answers by sitting around and waiting. He needed to talk to the old man, needed to understand who was after him and why they were so determined to keep him quiet. Rufus knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder gently. "Hey," he said, his voice low but firm. "Wake up." The old man groaned, his body twitching slightly. His eyes fluttered open, but they were glazed, unfocused. I told you not to get involved," he rasped, his voice thick with exhaustion. Rufus didn't let up. "You've already got me involved. I need answers. What's going on? Who are those people?" The man's eyes met his, a flicker of recognition in them. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, he looked towards the door, as though the threat was still looming outside. "They're not far," the man whispered. "They'll come back for me." Rufus clenched his fists. "You're not answering my question," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Who are they? What do they want from you?" The old man's eyes darted around the cabin, and for a moment, Rufus thought he wouldn't get an answer at all. But then the man's gaze softened, and he sighed deeply, his body sagging against the floor. "It's not just me they want," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "It's something much bigger." Rufus leaned in closer, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean? What are you talking about? The man closed his eyes as though the weight of his own words was too much to bear. I didn't know it would come to this, he said. I didn't know the consequences of what I saw, what I heard. He paused, struggling to sit up. I used to work for the government, he finally admitted, his voice weak. A long time ago. I was involved in something that should have never seen the light of day. Rufus stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. What kind of something, he asked. The man coughed, his body shuddering with the effort. I was part of a project, he muttered. Top secret, we were testing something that could change everything. But it went wrong, very wrong. And when it did, they shut it down, covered it up. Rufus's mind was racing. What did you see? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What did they do? The old man swallowed hard, his throat dry. I can't tell you everything, he said, his eyes filled with guilt. But they were trying to create a weapon, something that could control people, their minds, their actions. It was supposed to be a way to fight wars without firing a shot, without risking soldiers' lives. But it didn't work the way they thought it would. It turned into something else, something darker. Rufus's grip on his rifle tightened. And they've been hunting you because of it. The man nodded weakly. Ever since I left the project, they've been looking for me. They'll stop at nothing to make sure I don't talk. I've seen things that could change everything if they were exposed. Rufus stood there trying to absorb what the old man had just said. A weapon, a project that had gone wrong, and now these people were hunting him to cover it up. It sounded like something out of a bad movie, but the man's fear, the desperation in his voice, it was real. And it didn't stop there. You've got to hide, the old man said suddenly, his voice urgent. They'll come for you too. They'll come for both of us. You don't understand, this isn't just about me. It's about what I know, and they'll do anything to silence me. Rufus felt a chill crawl up his spine. He didn't know whether he should believe the man or not, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. Rufus stood frozen in place, rifle aimed at the door as the weight of the old man's words settled like a cold stone in his chest. The storm outside howled in violent gusts, but inside the cabin the air had become thick with a tension that was impossible to ignore. Scout remained by Rufus's side, his body tense, his ears pricked forward as if anticipating something. The sound of the door creaking made Rufus flinch, his finger tightening on the rifle trigger, ready to fire at the slightest hint of danger. He knew they weren't alone anymore. Someone or something was closing in on them, and every instinct told him that their time was running out. The old man, still on the floor beside the fire, had grown increasingly pale, his breath shallow and labored, as if the weight of the secrets he had carried for so long was finally taking its toll. Rufus's heart pounded in his chest. What had the man meant when he said, "They'll come for both of us"? Had the danger already arrived? Or was it something even worse lurking just beyond the storm? Rufus didn't have the answers, but what he did know was that the moment of reckoning was upon them. The door creaked again, this time more forcefully, and Rufus felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Something was out there just beyond the threshold. "Stay low," Rufus murmured to Scout, his voice barely above a whisper. The dog nodded slightly, sensing the gravity of the situation. Rufus's mind raced as he considered his next move. He couldn't stay in the cabin forever. He had to get the old man to safety, but he couldn't do it alone. The stakes were higher now. Whatever these people wanted, whatever they were, after. It was bigger than just Rufus's survival. It was about keeping the old man alive long enough to reveal the truth. He glanced at the old man, whose eyes were barely open, now his face gaunt and drawn from the strain. "You need to tell me everything," Rufus said, his voice firm despite the rising panic in his chest. The old man's eyes flickered as he tried to speak, his lips trembling with effort. "They'll come for me," he whispered. "But it's not just me they want, you too. You don't know what you're getting into." Rufus clenched his jaw, frustration mounting. He had already made up his mind. He was in this now, whether he liked it or not. If these people wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But he needed answers. He needed to understand what was truly at stake. "What did you see?" Rufus demanded, leaning closer to the old man. "What is it they want so badly?" The old man's breath hitched, and for a moment it seemed like he wouldn't be able to answer. But then, through gritted teeth, he managed to speak. "It's the files, the project, everything we were working on. They want it hidden. They can't let the truth get out. Not now, not after all these years." Rufus's heart sank. The old man was talking about something far more dangerous than a few rogue soldiers. This was bigger. This was a secret that could change the world. And whoever these people were, they were willing to kill to keep it that way. The door creaked again, louder this time, and Rufus turned toward it, his rifle raised. He wasn't waiting anymore. This was it. He was going to face whatever was out there head on. There was no running now. The storm outside had stopped for a moment, but in that silence, Rufus could hear the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow, slow and deliberate. They were here. The figures from earlier were back, and this time they weren't going to leave without what they came for. Rufus moved to the window, peeking out through the thin crack between the curtains. Through the swirling snow, he could make out shapes moving in the distance, steadily closing in on the cabin. There were more of them than before. He counted at least 4, maybe 5, and they were all carrying weapons. This wasn't just a group of strangers. This was an organized operation, a mission with a singular goal to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Rufus's fingers tightened on the rifle as he slowly turned back to the old man. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice sharp with urgency. The old man shook his head weakly, his body trembling. I can't. I'm not going anywhere." Rufus bit back a curse. He had to think fast. The old man wasn't in any condition to flee, and Scout was still too exhausted to run. Rufus couldn't carry both of them on his own, but he couldn't leave them to die either. He had come here to escape his past, but now he realized that escape wasn't an option anymore. There was no running from this. "Listen to me," Rufus said, kneeling down beside the old man. "We're getting out of here. I'll get you to safety, but you need to stay calm. I can't do this alone." The old man's eyes flickered with some semblance of understanding, but his body still wasn't cooperating. His hands shook as he tried to sit up, but the effort was too much. Rufus grabbed him by the shoulder, steadying him. "I'm not leaving you behind," he said firmly. "Now tell me what's the best way out of here." The old man's lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but then his eyes widened in fear. "They're coming," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "You don't have much time." Rufus's eyes narrowed as the footsteps grew closer. His mind raced. He had to move now, or it would be too late. "Get ready," Rufus said, moving to the door. He paused just long enough to look back at Scout, whose eyes were trained on him, waiting for a command. Rufus took a deep breath. "Stay close." He opened the door just enough to slip through the cold air, hitting his skin like a slap. The snow was coming down hard again, but he could still see the figures in the distance getting closer with every second. He had to act fast. Rufus stepped out into the storm rifle raised, ready to face whatever was coming. The wind howled around him, but his focus was razor sharp. He wasn't going down without a fight. He was going to protect the old man, protect Scout, no matter the cost. This was no longer about finding peace. It was about survival, and Rufus wasn't going to lose. Rufus stepped outside into the storm, his breath clouding in the cold air, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the approaching figures. The sound of footsteps had grown louder, and the steady crunch of snow beneath boots was unmistakable. The storm had swallowed the world around him, but the danger was clear, pressing in on all sides. The wind howled, making it difficult to hear anything else, but Rufus's senses were sharpened by the years he had spent in war zones, every fiber of his being attuned to the subtle signs of movement. Scout stood beside him, alert and ready, his hackles raised as he watched the figures grow nearer. The dog's body was coiled tight with anticipation, and Rufus could feel the same tension in his own chest. They were outnumbered, but he wasn't about to let them take the old man, not while he still had a choice. The figures were moving closer now, and Rufus's mind raced. He had to come up with a plan, anything to give them a chance. His heart pounded as the storm whipped around him, the swirling snow blurring his vision. He glanced over his shoulder at the cabin at the old man lying inside, still fragile and unable to move on his own. The old man's cryptic warnings echoed in his mind. "They'll come for both of us." Rufus wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to let fear control him, not now. There was no going back. The stakes were too high, and if these people were as dangerous as the old man said, they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Rufus had seen it before. He knew how quickly people could turn violent when they felt they had nothing to lose. These were not the kind of people you could reason with. These were hunters, not negotiators. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and the snow began to fall harder, the world outside becoming a blur of white. Rufus could see the figures now barely visible through the thick snow, moving steadily toward the cabin. There were at least 4 of them, and they weren't hesitating. They were coming for him, coming for the old man, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Rufus gritted his teeth and raised his rifle, scanning the figures as they drew nearer. His hands were steady, his grip firm, but his mind was racing. He couldn't let them get too close. He had to act first. The first figure, the tallest of the group, was leading the charge. Rufus recognized the cold, calculating look in his eyes. These weren't just ordinary people. They were professional soldiers or mercenaries trained to handle situations like this. They knew how to get what they wanted, and they knew how to do it efficiently. Rufus had seen men like this before. They were cold-blooded, willing to do whatever it took to achieve their goal. And right now, their goal was him and the old man. Rufus's eyes locked on the lead figure, and he felt a surge of determination. They weren't going to win this time. Not today. He took a deep breath and fired a warning shot into the air, the loud crack of the rifle breaking through the howling wind. The figures froze for a split second, but then they continued moving forward undeterred. The lead figure raised a hand signaling his men to advance. They were closing in faster now, and Rufus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The cold didn't matter anymore. The snow didn't matter. All that mattered was that he wasn't going to let them take the old man, not without a fight. The lead figure spoke, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "You're making a mistake," he shouted, his words carrying an edge of impatience. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Rufus's grip tightened on the rifle, but he didn't respond. There was no point in talking anymore. They had made it clear they weren't interested in negotiating. They were here to take, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Rufus moved behind a nearby tree, using it as cover, keeping his rifle trained on the approaching figures. His mind was calculating, analyzing the situation, weighing his options. He didn't have much time. The lead figure was close now, just a few yards away, and Rufus could see the man's face clearly. He was young, maybe in his 30s, but there was a hardness to him, a coldness in his eyes that spoke of someone who had seen too much, someone who had done things Rufus didn't even want to think about. The man's gaze flicked to Rufus's position, and for a moment their eyes locked. The tension between them was palpable, the unspoken understanding that one of them wasn't going to leave here alive. Rufus didn't hesitate. He fired. The bullet hit its mark, striking the lead figure in the shoulder. The man grunted, stumbling back, but he didn't fall. He immediately ducked behind a tree, his men following suit, taking cover and returning fire. The sound of gunshots rang out, and Rufus felt the force of the bullets striking the trees around him. He moved quickly, darting from one position to another, using the snow and trees for cover as the firefight escalated. Scout was by his side, moving with him, a silent partner in this fight for survival. The dog barked, alerting Rufus to movement ahead, and Rufus adjusted his aim, taking out one of the attackers who had tried to flank them. The figure dropped to the snow, his weapon skidding out of reach. But there was no time to celebrate. The remaining attackers were still advancing their fire, becoming more intense, more focused. Rufus's pulse raced as he assessed the situation. He was running low on ammo, and they were outnumbered. He needed a way out. He needed a distraction. Scout growled, his body tense as he crouched low, waiting for the next order. Rufus turned to him and whispered, "Go." Scout took off, charging toward the remaining attackers, barking loudly as he ran. The attackers hesitated for a moment, distracted by the dog's sudden movement, and Rufus used that moment to reposition himself, taking down another of the figures who had exposed himself. The dog's distraction had worked, but it wasn't enough. Rufus knew he had to make a move, and fast. He had to get the old man to safety. The sound of the wind howling through the trees was deafening, but in the midst of it, Rufus's focus remained sharp. He wasn't going to die today. Not while there was still breath in his lungs, not while he had a rifle in his hands and a dog by his side. The fight wasn't over, and it was only just beginning. Rufus moved through the snow rifle, gripped tightly in his hands, every step calculated, every breath deep and steady. The storm still raged around him, the cold wind cutting through the layers of his jacket, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting the old man to safety, getting out of this hellish storm, and putting an end to the threat that had been hunting them both. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him with every passing moment. His mind raced with options, but none of them seemed to offer a clear path to victory. The attackers had retreated deeper into the woods after the first wave of gunfire, but they hadn't gone far. Rufus knew they were regrouping, planning their next move. They wouldn't stop until they had what they came for: the old man's knowledge, his files, the secret they were willing to kill for. Rufus could feel the gravity of it all, the truth the old man had revealed, the power of the information he held, and the lengths people would go to keep it hidden. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger than them both. The truth the lives lost in the pursuit of that truth, the choices made that could never be undone. Rufus understood now that it was all connected. He wasn't just protecting the old man, he was protecting the future, the truth that could change everything. The wind howled again, and Rufus paused to check his rifle. Scout was still by his side, moving with him through the thick snow. The dog was focused, his eyes sharp, his movements precise, as if he understood the importance of every step. They moved as one, a team forged in the heat of battle. The air was thick with anticipation, but there was still no sign of the attackers. Rufus could hear them moving in the distance, but their exact location remained unclear. They were closing in, though Rufus was certain of it. He looked over at the old man, who was still weak but holding on. His eyes were distant, but Rufus knew that the old man had more to say. He had more to explain, more to reveal, but they had no time. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. "We need to move," Rufus said, his voice low but firm. The old man nodded weakly, though he still seemed out of sorts. I know," he whispered, "but there's more. There's more they won't stop at." Rufus didn't wait for him to elaborate. They didn't have time for the past, not when the present was so unforgiving. He motioned for the old man to follow as he led them deeper into the trees. He was moving quickly now, not looking back, but knowing the dog and the old man were right behind him. He could hear the shuffling of boots in the snow, the sound of the attackers drawing closer. They were getting too close, and Rufus knew they couldn't afford to be caught in the open. The trees ahead of him were sparse, the snow already knee-deep, but there was a break in the woods, a small clearing, just enough space to make a stand, if it came to that. He moved toward it, his breath visible in the frigid air. The moment they reached the clearing, Rufus froze, his body tense, listening intently. He could hear the footsteps now, much closer than before. He wasn't alone anymore. They were here. The attackers had found them. Scout growled softly beside him, his eyes fixed on the figures emerging from the trees. There were 4 of them, more than Rufus had anticipated, but he wasn't afraid. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. Not now, not when the old man's life and the future hung in the balance. The first figure stepped forward, a dark shape in the distance, his rifle raised. Rufus raised his own, aiming at the man's chest, ready to fire. The man didn't hesitate. He opened fire, first the bullet missing Rufus by mere inches as he darted behind a nearby tree for cover. The world erupted in gunfire, the crack of rifles ringing through the clearing, and Rufus moved with deadly precision, his body low to the ground, rifle raised and steady. He returned fire, hitting one of the attackers in the leg. The man fell cursing, but he didn't stay down for long. The rest of the group spread out, trying to flank Rufus and the old man, but Rufus was faster. He fired again, taking out another figure, but the remaining 2 were still closing in. The snow was heavy, the wind blinding, but it didn't matter. Rufus's focus was unwavering. The dog moved beside him, ready to attack, if needed, its growls and barks the only sound in the chaos. Rufus fired again, the shot ringing true, hitting one of the men in the shoulder. He screamed in pain, but Rufus didn't hesitate. He kept moving, aiming at the last figure, who was now less than 10 yards away. This was it. This was the moment. The man fired, but Rufus ducked behind a large tree, narrowly avoiding the shot. His heart raced, but he stayed focused, listening to the sound of the wind and the gunfire. The air was thick with tension, but Rufus didn't give in to the fear. He knew this fight wasn't just about survival. It was about making sure the old man's knowledge didn't fall into the wrong hands. This was about the future, the truth that had been buried for so long. The man moved closer, rifle raised, but Rufus was ready. He peeked out from behind the tree and fired. The shot hit its mark, the man collapsing in the snow, his rifle falling from his grasp. Rufus stood there, breathing heavily, scanning the clearing for any more threats. But there was nothing. The battle was over. He had won. The storm had quieted, and the world seemed to stand still for a moment, as if acknowledging the end of something. Rufus lowered his rifle, exhaling slowly. Scout walked over to him, nudging his leg with its nose, and Rufus patted the dog's head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Good boy," he murmured. The old man, still trembling, stood slowly, his legs shaking. Rufus turned to him. "It's over," he said, his voice steady. The old man nodded, his eyes tired, but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved me. You saved all of us." Rufus didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The storm had passed, and with it the danger. For the first time in days, Rufus felt a sense of peace. He had done what he needed to do. He had protected the truth, and he had protected the people who mattered. And in that moment, with Scout by his side and the old man safe, Rufus realized something important. The past could never be erased, but the future was still his to shape. And that was enough. The end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales. What did you think of the plot? Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts.